Rod, thank you very much for inviting me to join today, and I know you are time poor today. Firstly, could we just move on to the first one, please? First slide. The next slide, please. Thanks. So look, I won't go through this line by line. I went to Indonesia in 1992 to work for a joint venture up there, which really was the first big modern feedlot in Indonesia. We imported about 60 to 70,000 cattle a year. It was a 17,000 head unit. 1997 came along. That was the Asian financial crisis. Everything shut down in regard to importation. I was lucky enough to do a joint venture with a very good friend of mine, Dickie Adiwaso, and Consolidated Pastoral Company in 1999. And we did a lot of custom feeding in Indonesia in the next 2 or 3 years. So we brought cattle in from Australia, rented feedlots in Indonesia and fed them there and sold them into our old markets. In 2000, we actually started to build 2 feedlots in Sumatra in Indonesia. Combined capacity of those 2 feedlots, about 35,000 head. And between 2000 and 2016, we imported about 2 million cattle in our own right. A lot of those cattle came from our joint venture partner, CPC. I got out of the feedlots in 2016, and now from 2006 onwards, I still lucky enough to go back and consult to JJA, but I also consult to a lot of countries around the world, including Vietnam. And I've been to Vietnam about 4 or 5 times and have been lucky enough to work with a few feedlots and actually stay some time on feedlots in Vietnam and help the teams over there with my ideas of how I think they should be feeding cattle. Interesting enough, I was in Vietnam only 2 weeks ago, and I hadn't been there for 3 years before for COVID, and I was amazingly surprised and happy, and really the progression in the last 3 years, I believe, in Vietnam feeding styles has really gone ahead in leaps and bounds. In 2019, I bought a share in Frontier International, which exports cattle to Indonesia and Vietnam. Next slide, please. So Indonesia, just very quick, 280 million people, 17,000 islands, very fertile soil, an average per capita of about $4,300, a little bit more than Vietnam. Next slide, please. So went to Indonesia, 1992. The company was called Tipperary Indonesia. It was a joint venture between Australia and Indonesia. Next slide, please. We did lots of things strange, but we haven't swayed away from trying to find those byproducts to feed to animals. So we fed a lot of bananas, we fed a lot of pineapple, we fed a lot of tapioca. There were some great photos in the last presentation of silage making. We didn't have a tractor when I first went there in 1992, 1993, but we did have a lot of elephants. And we made between 4,000 and 5,000 tonnes a year of silage with elephants. And unfortunately, we didn't have many cameras back then. And so that's the one photo I have of us making silage with an elephant. Next, please. So feedlotting in Indonesia started in the 90s, again, very much based on byproducts, high amount of manual labour. Labour rate over there is $12 a day. Fuel, diesel, $1.10 US a day. Our feedlots are located in the tropics, 250 millimetres of rain, constant 30 degrees, high humidity. Next, please. Majority of the feedlots are covered, all concrete pens. The current capacity of feedlots in Indonesia about 250,000 head, of which there's about 25 feedlots in Indonesia. To date, all cattle come from Australia. There is some talk of maybe some cattle coming from Brazil or Mexico. Total imports per year, about 300 to 1 million. There was 1 million cattle come in the mid 2000s. Surprisingly enough, those 500 to 700,000, which at average only supplies 15% of Indonesia's beef requirements. Indonesians eat about 2.1 kilograms of beef per year. and the sector employs well over 10,000 people. Next slide, please. Just a quick slide there on how many cattle go to Indonesia as opposed to Vietnam. In the last 6 years, Indonesia has imported about 2.8 million cattle. And in the last 6 years, Vietnam has imported about 1.1 million cattle. Interestingly enough, Vietnam was the biggest importer of cattle from Queensland, about 640,000 cattle in the last 6 years. And Indonesia only imported about 630,000 cattle. Next slide, please. That just explains just the difference of cattle exported to Vietnam, but I've spoken about those figures. Next slide, please. So I just want to talk about how I've done feedlotting in Indonesia and some of the ways that I think may be able to be used in Vietnam. Next slide, please. So when you go out and select a site, or when you want to go out and build a feedlot, there are some really fundamental things that you need to think of. And unfortunately, in one of my feedlots in Indonesia, we didn't do the homework into water supply enough. Remember, an animal drinks 50 litres of water a day. If you've got 15 or 20,000 head of water, that means you need 1,000 tonnes of water per day. That's very, very important, and you need it every day of the year. So water storage is very important. You also talk about weather. What's the wind? What's the temperature? What ways the wind come from? Which ways the rainfall come from? Which ways the airflow come from? All very, very important factors when you're going to build a feedlot. As we all know, if you've got an animal, you've got manure, you've got effluent, and you've got between 15 and 30 kilograms per day per animal. Again, if you're talking about a 15 or 20,000 head feedlot, that means you've got 600 tonnes of manure per day. And that is, as we all know, a major, major factor when talking about feeding any type of animal. So I cannot emphasise the thought and the planning that needs to go into your manure disposal, effluent control, and just general control and maintenance of manure. Population proximity, as we increase population, both Indonesia and Vietnam, we have urban encroachment, we have villages close to our feedlots, we have people building facilities or houses close to feedlots, so it's close to work, and we have flies, we have smells. Again, very, very important to think about, and that's where your wind aspects come into place, population proximity. I'll talk about it a little bit later, but forage crops, it's very, very important that you have forage crops close at hand. They are the most bulky item that you're going to be transporting. So the proximity to corn and grasses, very, very important. Market, probably the most important. If you're going to build a feedlot and you're going to produce a product, you need to be very, very clear and very, very sure about where your product is going. And we all know you load an animal onto a truck, you transport it 100 kilometres, you transport it 200 kilometres, you transport it 300 kilometres, it will lose weight, and it will lose different amounts of weight for different times of the year and the different distance it's travelled. Staff also extremely important. Make sure you've got great staff, and you've got to give them facilities which they like staying at, they like living at, and they like coming back to work. That's one of our feedlots in Indonesia. Big sheds, high capacity sheds, and we also have a lot of cattle out in the open. Our new cattle arrive and go into the open. Next photo, please. Next slide, please. So design and construction, I like to high capacity, high density. So feedlots, I believe that you can run cattle at about 2.3 to 2.5 metres per head in concrete undercover pens. There's a lot of different things you need to do if you're going to run cattle at that density, but it can be done. Pen slope, I don't think you should be frightened to put a slope on your pens. The more slope you have on the pens, the better you have runoff, and the drier the pens will be. Extremely important to have no slip on your pens. Cattle like to run around at different times. They, especially with a pen has got a build-up of manure on it, a slippery pen means animals slip over, they get foot injuries, they break their legs, and that all becomes a cost. Trough length, we're seeing a lot of feedlots now go towards just floor feeding. Again, that's I think that's a great idea. I prefer trough feeding, so it's very important to have the correct width, the height from the floor to the trough, the rail position. If the animal feels uncomfortable or doesn't feel like it wants to go to the trough to have something to eat, it will not go to the trough. So very, very important that your feed trough is the right fit for the animal, because that's where the animal's going to put on its kilograms, at the feed trough. Water troughs, again, big troughs, ample supply. We see too many feedlots put in feed troughs, put in water troughs which don't have the correct size pipes, and so they take so long to fill up. Cattle need water at particular times of the day, and they all need water at those times of the day. So extremely important to have troughs which are full, especially at the hotter periods of the day, and troughs which are easy to clean. The roof slope and the height, remember, we're all going towards machinery. We all need to get machinery into sheds now, whether they're front-end loaders or tip trucks. Very important to have the right height on your sheds. All our sheds have an 18% or 18 degrees slope, and that's what we believe is the best slope for the extraction of ammonia and wind. Roof construction, I'm seeing lots of sheds built here in Australia at the moment which are built out of tin. Tin sheds, in my first experience in Indonesia, lasted for 5 years, and we had to replace it. We use a fibre or solar plex sheeting now, and you can also spray an insulation underneath it. But do remember, you're putting up that asset to house those cattle for as long as possible, so maintenance of that asset is imperative. Post footings, again, concrete around the posts, manure gets on the post, they rust out very quickly, very important. Build it right for the first time and it will last. Next slide, please. Typical shed designs. Next slide, please. Central feed row, very high density cattle populations in those pens. We would feed those pens 5 times a day. They would be cleaned every 4 days. They would be walked 3 to 4 times a day. We would get fractionally lower weight gains, but we would have a lot higher turnover. And now is the time for high turnover. All our feeding is with mechanical mixers using tractor-pulled Supreme mixers from Canada. Next slide, please. So what sort of cattle do we feed? I think we're a little bit different. I know we're a little bit different to how we feed cattle in Vietnam and the type of animal we feed. So we are traditionally feeder cattle. So we feed an animal, we bring it over, we fatten it for 100 days, and then we turn it off at about 500, 520 kilos. So the average weight in, about 330 kilograms. We do some older cattle, cows, bulls, and slaughter types. They average about 400 kilograms in. But when you're buying cattle, it's very, very important that you understand the cattle supply, the seasonality, and the logistics in Australia. It's, as you all know, you cannot just ring up and say, please send me a boatload of 600 kilogram bulls next week. It is a massive amount of planning in Australia to put shipments of cattle together. And so we really, really need to understand, when buying cattle, the ordering well ahead and giving the exporter a good idea and a long lead time is very important for you to get what you want and the best article you want. When the cattle arrive in Indonesia, comfort, comfort, comfort. It's a comfortable animal is an animal which will produce and will give you the best results. Best practice animal welfare. So you've got to make sure your facility is well built and there's no bad corners, there's no holes. Best animal welfare is what we really, really want to see. And that, again, gives you the best results. Consistency in the pen. So consistency in the feed pens in regard to the cattle size, so don't have small cattle and big cattle together. Obviously, don't have male and female together. Don't have bulls and small bulls together. Consistency, consistent size cattle in the pen is very, very important to give every animal in that pen the opportunity to move forward. Feeding times, we have very strict feeding times in Indonesia. Every pen gets fed at the same time every day. And if that's 5 times a day, it gets fed at the same time every day. So it's very, very important. Those cattle get into a routine, and they know that the feed wagon is going to turn up at 7:25, and within 5 minutes of each side of 7:25, unless we have a breakdown or a major problem, those cattle are fed at 7:25 for that particular pen. Cleaning, again, comfort, very, very important. Cattle have got to be comfortable, and cleaning is one way to do that. We use a lot of bedding in Indonesia. It is costly. It is expensive, but I really believe it gives us an extra 0.2 of a day weight gain when using bedding. Health program, monitoring for sickness and disease. Indonesia has just got lumpy skin disease and foot and mouth disease, so we've really had some problems with sickness and disease in the last 12 to 18 months. We are getting on top of that, but your health teams must be really on top of it. It's very, very important, and you can make a lot of money when you make sure your cattle are sick, and those cattle that are sick are pulled out and treated accordingly. One thing I have noticed in Vietnam is the reluctance or not desire to use individual identification, so ear tags on individual cattle for individual shipments. I really think that cattle should be individually identified. It leads to a lot of positives. You can select for sick cattle. You can know when a sick cattle's gone back to a pen. You can know individual performance. And one of the big things that I'm pushing at the moment is you can know the origin of the animal. Look, you can look at the brands of the animal, yes, but if you know when the animal arrived, where it came from, when it's been weighed during the time at your feedlot, what the weight gains that's been at your feedlot, it is really, really important to use that data to go back and buy cattle in the future. As I said, frequency 5 toes a day. You need to look at the cattle to look at their behaviour, their feed aggression. Next, please. Typical cattle, as you can see, bedding there, not a tight pen, but that's how we would traditionally maybe cattle which had been there for 60 or 70 days, loosen them off, but make sure their bedding is superb. Those cattle would be cleaned every 4 to 6 days. Next slide, please. So what's the normal in Indonesia? As I said, touched on it. Could you please ring a bell when you'd like me to finish up to? 300 to 330 kilograms in. 30% would be heifers. We still prefer the high-grade Brahmins, but there's some crossbreds. 90 to 100 days feeding. Weight gains over the last 25 years have improved dramatically. Traditionally, we got 0.8, 0.9. Now it's not unusual to see 2 kilograms per day on really, really, really good cattle, especially in the dry season. We will see 2s, but traditionally most feedlots in Indonesia are between 1.2 and 1.7 kilograms a day. There are a lot of factors, obviously. You can't just say, I'm going to get 1.7. There's a huge number of factors for you to get 1.7. Most rations in Indonesia are all total mixed rations, and they're mixed on site. So the feedlot buys the commodities, they mix them on site, and they feed them on site. There are very few, if any, pellet-based rations in Indonesia. Everyone buys the commodities and mixes them per day. 13 to 18 kilograms as fed. Usually most rations are about 30% moisture. Water intake, as we said, 40 to 50 litres per day. Sale weight, considerably less than Vietnam, 450 to 500 kilograms with no curfew. So people feed their animals in the afternoon and they sell them in the afternoon. So it's a full weight. So we sell full weight, 450 to 500 kilograms. Carcass yields, 51 to 56%. Again, there's a huge variation depending on how you're feeding your cattle. Meat yields, 35 to 38. We're a bit different in Indonesia. We like a bright red coloured meat. We like a lean calf carcass. We like really white fat, and we like a minimum amount of fat. So a credit provided to buyers. Next slide, please. Typical animals arrived, put outside. Next, please. So slaughter cattle. Rob, are we right to keep going? I can't hear.
Yeah, no, you're right. So I think we met finish up in the next minute.
Yeah.
Next minute or
okay.
two.
So slaughter cattle. So just go to the next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. So feed. Next slide. Next again. I just want to talk about our fodder. So commodities. You in Vietnam, you have some really, really good commodities, and they are very, very consistent. We use in Indonesia, we use a lot of molasses, palm kernel meal. Our starch comes from corn and tapioca. We use a lot of byproducts, and our forage comes mainly from corn. So we mainly use 70 to 80 day corn with the cob, or we do use some grass 40 to 50 days. We use silage only when we need to use silage. We would much prefer to use green chop. Next slide, please.
Next slide.
So we use a lot of this odot grass, which was the slide before, and this is a typical corn. So corn, our corn is still very, very basic grown. We do not use any machinery and hardly any process of corn processing. So, but we are getting yields of around about 25 to 45 tons per hectare. So we can grow 3 crops at least a year in Indonesia because of our rainfall, and we're using manure on those crops. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So what I to take away today, cattle comfort, very, very important. Consistency throughout the whole feeding process. Know your feed. Make sure you test your feeds. It's good to see a feed that looks good. If you don't test it, you don't know what's in it. Fodder, it is the real key to good gains. Get some external advice, whether it be on feed not nutrition, whether it's been on feed yard design, whether it'll be on your health program. We always need external advice. You need to pay for it, but it pays dividends all the time. Individual monitoring and recording I've talked about, and days on feed. You really need to work out how many days you want to feed an animal so it doesn't get fat and it gets optimum ADG. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg.
So obviously I've clipped over a few pieces there, but obviously those slides that I clipped over, you'll be able to share amongst the delegates today, and they can have a look at them themselves if they need to.